At my grandmother's while reading, my cousin Lily sat there smiling while everyone else inherited houses, money, and jewelry. When the lawyer handed me my envelope, I opened it and found just two words. Not you. Lily acted surprised, but her smirk said otherwise. A year later, I discovered secret recordings that proved she and my aunt lied to my grandma about me. And when the whole family heard the tapes, Lily ran out of the memorial service without saying a word. My name is Brandon Hayes, and until about a year ago, I genuinely believed my family was dysfunctional only in the harmless, almost comedic way people joke about at holiday dinners. The kind of dysfunction where someone inevitably drinks too much wine, an argument starts about politics that nobody actually understands, and an aunt makes passive-aggressive comments about everyone else's life choices, while pretending she is only concerned about their well-being. I grew up thinking that was normal, that every family probably had the same strange little tensions simmering beneath the surface, but still managed to come together when it mattered. From the outside, we looked exactly like that kind of family. Loud, messy, occasionally irritating, but ultimately loyal to one another. At the center of all of it was my grandmother, Margaret Whitmore. Every important event in our lives, somehow, revolved around her house on the lake just outside Asheville, North Carolina. The place itself felt almost legendary in our family. It was a massive old house with creaky wooden floors, wide windows facing the water, and a long porch where everyone gathered in the evenings while the sun sank behind the trees. I spent so many summers there as a kid that I can still remember the exact smell of the place, a mixture of pine trees, lake water, and the faint scent of my grandmother's cooking drifting through the kitchen. No matter how complicated things became between her 5 children, and trust me, things were often complicated, they always ended up back at that house eventually. Margaret Whitmore had 5 kids, which meant there were uncles, aunts, cousins, spouses, and eventually grandchildren constantly rotating through that place like characters in a long-running show. My grandmother had more opinions than anyone I had ever met in my life, and she never hesitated to share them. She had a way of speaking that made it almost impossible to interrupt her. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but there was something about her tone that made people listen. Even my Uncle Daniel, who was the most stubborn man I've ever known, would suddenly fall quiet when she began talking. She had this quiet authority that everyone respected, whether they wanted to admit it or not. In a strange way, she functioned as a judge and referee for the entire family. If 2 relatives were arguing, she settled it. If someone needed advice, they called her. If there was a story about the past that nobody else remembered correctly, she would calmly explain exactly how things really happened. She remembered everything, every birthday, every embarrassing childhood story, every family secret that people tried to pretend never existed. When she spoke about the past, it felt like listening to a living archive. But more than anything, she was a glue that somehow kept our strange group together. Without her, I honestly doubt half of the family would have spoken to each other at all. Growing up, I always felt like she treated me differently than some of the others, though I never knew exactly why. Maybe it was because I was the quiet kid who preferred listening to stories instead of running around with the other cousins. Maybe it was because I spent more time at the lake house than most of them did. My parents both worked long hours when I was younger, and during the summers they often sent me to stay with her for weeks at a time. Those summers are some of the clearest memories I have. She would wake up early every morning, long before anyone else, and sit on the porch with a cup of tea while the lake was completely still. Sometimes I would wake up and find her there, watching the water like she was waiting for something to happen. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she would smile and wave me over, telling me that the quiet hours before everyone else woke up were the best part of the day. Then she would start telling stories, sometimes about her childhood, sometimes about the early days of the family, sometimes about things that had happened long before I was born. She always spoke to me like I was someone whose opinion mattered, which was something I didn't feel very often as a kid. When the rest of the family talked, the adults usually spoke over the younger people or dismissed whatever we said. My grandmother never did that. If I asked a question, she answered it seriously. If I disagreed with something, she listened. It might sound like a small thing, but to a kid it meant a lot. One tradition she kept for years was writing me a letter every single birthday. Not a quick card with a signature at the bottom, but a full letter written in her careful, elegant cursive handwriting. She would talk about what had happened during the past year, give me advice about something she thought I might struggle with, and always ended by reminding me that the world was bigger than whatever problem I was worried about at the moment. I still have every one of those letters in a small box in my apartment. Because of things like that, I truly believed I was one of the people she loved the most. So when she passed away at the age of 87, it hit me harder than I expected. Losing a grandparent isn't unusual, but the absence she left behind felt enormous. The lake house suddenly felt different, quieter in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. Family gatherings stopped happening as often, and when they did, something about them felt slightly forced, like everyone was trying to recreate a tradition that no longer had its center. Even so, I mourned her with a quiet certainty that she had cared about me in a way that would last beyond her lifetime. I believed that whatever final wishes she had left behind, whatever decisions she had made about the future of the family and the things she owned, she would never forget me. A month after the funeral, the illusion I had been holding on to finally shattered in a cramped law office that looked nothing like the place where I imagined a woman like my grandmother's last wishes would be revealed. I had expected something dignified, maybe even warm in some strange way, but the room was small and stale, with beige walls, low fluorescent lighting, and shelves crowded with binders that looked older than some of my cousins. The whole place smelled like dust, old paper, and coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate long enough to turn bitter. Even before the reading began, I remember feeling a kind of discomfort I could not explain, like the room itself was warning me that whatever happened there would leave a mark. The entire family had shown up, which in itself felt unusual, because in the weeks after my grandmother's death, there had already been small signs of distance forming between people. At the funeral, everyone had been solemn and careful, wrapped in the protective politeness that grief sometimes creates. But a month later, that layer had already started to peel away. People were watching one another too closely, speaking a little too carefully, measuring tone and expression in a way that made it obvious but mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. My mother sat beside me, close enough that our arms touched, and every few minutes she squeezed my hand as though she were trying to steady me or maybe reassure herself. At the time, I interpreted it as optimism. I honestly thought she was calm because she already knew, on some emotional level, that my grandmother had left me something meaningful. My mother had always known how close I was to her, and I think she believed what I believed, that there was no scenario in which my grandmother would overlook me. Every time my mother pressed my hand, I felt that confidence sink a little deeper into me. Across from us, my Aunt Claire looked perfectly composed, almost unnaturally so. She wore a sharp navy suit that made her look less like someone grieving her mother and more like someone about to walk into a boardroom and take control of a negotiation. That was always Claire's style. She never let emotion show unless she had decided it served a purpose. Her posture was rigid, elegant, controlled, and the only sign that this day meant anything to her was the way her jaw tightened whenever the lawyer shifted papers on his desk. She looked prepared, not nervous. Next to her sat my cousin Lily with her fiancé, and even now I can picture the expression on his face with painful clarity. He was a real estate broker, one of those polished, overly confident guys who always seemed like he was mentally calculating the value of every room he entered. While the rest of us looked tense or sad, or at least respectful, he looked almost eager, not openly enough that someone could call him out on it, but enough that it was impossible not to notice. He had that restrained kind of excitement people wear when they think something profitable is about to happen. Lily leaned into him with the same smug calm, and together they looked less like grieving relatives and more like people waiting for an announcement they had privately been expecting. The lawyer himself was exactly the kind of man you would imagine handling old family money and older family resentment. He was quiet, formal, and so practiced an emotional detachment that his face barely moved when he spoke. He adjusted his glasses, opened a file in front of him, and began reading the will piece by piece in an even voice that somehow made everything sound more final. There was no ceremony to it, no pause for sentiment, just names, items, assets, decisions, a life reduced to legal instructions. At first, everything unfolded in a way that felt almost normal, which only made what happened later more surreal. My Uncle Robert received my grandmother's rare coin collection, something that actually made sense because he had spent years pretending not to care about it while secretly bringing it up every chance he got. Aunt Claire inherited the lake house, and even though I felt something sink in my chest when I heard that, I could not say I was shocked. She had always acted as though the house was already part of her identity, and judging by the small shift in her expression, she had probably expected it. Lily was given my grandmother's diamond ring, and her hand immediately went to her chest in this performance of emotion that I found hard to believe. My mother received a large investment portfolio, which seemed practical and substantial, the kind of inheritance that signaled trust and long-term care. With each name that was called, each item assigned, I kept waiting for my turn with a sense of calm certainty. Everyone was getting something meaningful, something personal, something that connected them to my grandmother in a clear and deliberate way. Even when I felt a slight sting at hearing the lake house go to Claire instead of being divided or preserved in some way, I still thought there would be something for me that made sense. Maybe the letters she had written me, maybe some private keepsake, Maybe something she'd say because she knew I would understand its value. Then the lawyer said my name. It is strange how clearly I remember the way the room changed in that exact second. Until then, there had been the faint rustle of clothing, the sound of someone shifting in their chair, the distant hum of the office air conditioner. But the moment he spoke my name, it was as if the entire room tightened around me. Every face turned in my direction. I felt it physically, that sudden collective attention, and for one brief moment, I even thought maybe my mother had been right to keep squeezing my hand. Maybe this was a part where something unexpected but deeply meaningful happened. Maybe my grandmother had left me a letter explaining why I mattered to her, or some private inheritance no one else would understand. But instead of reading an item from a will, the lawyer reached into a file and pulled out a sealed envelope. He did not explain it immediately. He simply looked at me, then held it out across the desk. My name was written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. That was what hit me first. Not confusion, not dread, but recognition. I knew her handwriting, as well as I knew my own. I had spent years opening birthday letters with that same elegant cursive on the envelope. Letters that always made me feel seen, remembered, chosen in some quiet way. Seeing my name written by her hand in that room, after hearing everyone else receive pieces of her life, made my chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. I took the envelope slowly, aware that every person in that office was watching me. My fingers actually hesitated at the edge of the paper because some part of me still believed there was going to be tenderness inside it. My mother leaned slightly toward me. No one spoke. Even the lawyer stayed silent. I opened it carefully, trying not to tear the paper more than necessary, and pulled out a single sheet. There were only 2 words inside. Not you. For a second, my mind refused to process them. I looked at the page again, then again, as though I had somehow missed the rest of the message, as though another sentence had to be there somewhere hidden in the fold. But there was nothing else. No explanation. No signature. No context. Just those 2 words in the same unmistakable handwriting that had once written me pages filled with warmth and care. Not you. I felt the blood drain from my face, so fast it made me dizzy. The room did not blur exactly, but it seemed to tilt in a way that made everyone look slightly unreal. I could feel every pair of eyes still fixed on me, and that made the humiliation worse because this was not private grief or private confusion. This was public. This was deliberate. Every person in that room had just watched me go from being a grandson who had always seemed close to Margaret Whitmore to the one singled out for exclusion in the cruelest possible way. I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. I just stared at the paper while the meaning settled into me like something cold and poisonous. Everyone else had received objects, property, security, symbols of love or approval or remembrance. I had received 2 words, and those words were not neutral. They were not accidental. They were not an omission or a forgotten detail. They were direct, personal, final. Not you. At first, I genuinely believed I had misunderstood what I was looking at, because the human brain has a strange way of protecting itself from moments that feel too sharp or too sudden to accept immediately. I stared at the sheet of paper for several seconds, convinced there had to be more to it, that maybe another page had slipped out of the envelope or that some part of the message had folded behind the paper when I pulled it out. My eyes moved across the page again and again, tracing the 2 words in my grandmother's familiar cursive, waiting for the rest of the sentence to reveal itself somehow. The letters were written clearly, with the same elegant strokes I had seen in every birthday letter she had ever sent me, the same calm handwriting that used to fill entire pages with stories and advice. But this time there was nothing else surrounding them. No greeting, no explanation, no signature, no closing thought that might soften the meaning. Just those 2 words sitting alone in the center of the page. Not you. I even turned the paper over once, half expecting there to be something written on the back that would suddenly make the message make sense, but the back of the page was blank and cold and empty. I slid my fingers inside the envelope again just to check if something else had been tucked inside without my noticing, but the envelope contained nothing more than that single sheet. The realization crept over me slowly, the way cold spreads through your body when you step into freezing water. There was no second page. There was no explanation waiting somewhere else in the file. That was the entire message my grandmother had chosen to leave for me. For a few seconds, I simply sat there staring down at the paper while the silence in the room thickened around me. It felt like the air had changed temperature, like the room itself had become colder in a way that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. My chest felt tight and hollow at the same time, as if my body could not decide whether to react with anger or disbelief. The strange thing was that my mind kept trying to invent explanations that might make the moment less brutal. Maybe it was some kind of mistake. Maybe the lawyer had handed me the wrong envelope. Maybe this was only the beginning of a longer message that would be explained afterward. I found myself looking up slowly, hoping that someone in the room would say something that would make the situation clearer. But no one did. Instead, the first sound that broke the silence was a short laugh. It was quick, almost instinctive, and for a moment it seemed like the person who made it immediately regretted letting it escape. I turned my head toward the sound and saw my Aunt Claire covering her mouth with her hand, as though she had tried to disguise the reaction a second too late. Her eyes flickered downward toward the table, and she adjusted her posture in that controlled way she always had when she realized people were watching her too closely. The gesture might have fooled someone who did not know her well, but I had spent my entire life observing that family, and I knew exactly what I had just heard. Across from her, my cousin Lily did not even bother hiding her reaction. There was no laugh from her, but the corner of her mouth lifted in a slow, satisfied smirk that she did nothing to conceal. She leaned slightly toward her fiancé, and although neither of them said anything, the look they shared lasted just long enough to make the humiliation sink deeper into my chest. It was the kind of expression people exchange when they feel quietly vindicated about something they have already discussed privately. Seeing that look made it clear that whatever had just happened was not entirely unexpected to them. I felt my stomach twist when I realized that. My eyes moved across the room again, searching for some sign that someone else was as shocked as I was, that someone might speak up and say this had to be a misunderstanding. When I looked at my mother, the expression on her face was the closest thing to genuine surprise I could find in that room. Her eyes were wide and her lips slightly parted, as though she had just heard something she could not immediately process. For a moment, I thought she was about to say something, maybe question the lawyer or demand an explanation, but she remained completely silent. Her hand had loosened around mine, without me even noticing when it happened. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in a room full of people. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the lawyer seemed strangely detached, watching the scene with the same neutral patience he had shown while reading the rest of the will. It felt as though the entire room had accepted the moment instantly while I was still trying to understand it. The humiliation settled into me in waves, each one sharper than the last. I became painfully aware that every person in that office had just witnessed something intensely personal unfold in front of them, and that there was no way to escape that fact. I had not simply been excluded from the will. I had been singled out, deliberately and publicly, with two words that carried more rejection than any silence ever could have. The message had not been vague or indirect. It had not been the absence of my name. It had been written specifically for me. Not you. After another few seconds that felt much longer than they actually were, I realized that continuing to sit there would only make the moment worse. There was nothing I could say that would restore my dignity in that room, and there was nothing anyone else seemed willing to offer that would make the situation less cruel. My hands felt strangely steady as I folded the sheet of paper along the same crease it had when it came out of the envelope. I slid it back inside carefully, almost mechanically, as though I were performing a small, quiet ritual to seal the moment away. I placed the envelope on the table for a second, then picked it up again. Then I stood. The chair legs made a soft scraping sound against the floor, which briefly drew everyone's attention again, even though they had never really stopped watching me. I did not look directly at anyone as I pushed the chair back into place. My body moved automatically, guided more by instinct than conscious thought. I turned toward the door, walked across the small office, and reached for the handle. No one tried to stop me. No one said my name. I stepped out into the hallway, closed the door behind me, and walked through the quiet corridors of that building without looking back once. The air outside the office felt warmer, but it did nothing to ease a hollow pressure in my chest. I left the building, got into my car, and drove away from that place with the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside me. No one followed me. No one called after me. And in the days that followed, no one from that room gave me an explanation that would change what had happened there. That afternoon became the last time I saw my family for nearly a year. At first, I ignored the messages that appeared on my phone in the hours after I left the law office. Some of them were short and awkward, others longer but strangely careful, as though the people writing them were trying to acknowledge what had happened without actually addressing it directly. I did not answer any of them. Over the next few weeks, I stopped responding entirely. Eventually, the messages slowed, then stopped. Within a few months, I packed my things, left North Carolina behind, and moved to another city in Tennessee where no one knew anything about the Whitmore family or the lake house or the will reading that had changed everything. I found a small apartment, focused on work, and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with the people I had grown up around. From the outside, it probably looked like I was moving on. But no matter how far I went or how much time passed, those two words never left my mind. Not you. Almost a full year had passed since the day I walked out of that law office. And during that time, I had done everything I could to build a life that did not revolve around the memory of that moment. I had moved to a different city in Tennessee, found a quiet apartment that overlooked a row of trees instead of lake, and thrown myself into work with the kind of determination people sometimes develop when they are trying not to think about something painful. For the most part, the strategy worked on the surface. My daily routine became predictable and stable in a way my life had never really been before. I woke up, went to work, came home, cooked simple dinners, watched television, and slowly created a circle of acquaintances who knew nothing about my family or the strange ending to my relationship with them. The envelope itself remained in a small box inside my closet, buried beneath old papers and things I rarely touched. I never threw it away, but I also never opened again. The two words written on that sheet had carved themselves into my memory so deeply that I did not need to see them anymore. They were already there, repeating in quiet moments when my mind wandered too far back toward the past. For months, no one from my family contacted me. At first, there had been scattered messages after the reading, some awkward, some defensive, none of them actually explaining what had happened. I ignored all of them. Eventually, the messages stopped altogether, which in a strange way made things easier. The silence allowed me to pretend that entire part of my life had simply closed like a door. Then, almost exactly a year later, that silence broke. I was sitting on my couch late in the evening, half paying attention to a television show I could barely follow, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table beside me. At first, I did not think much of it. Notifications came and went all the time, most of them work emails or automated reminders about things I had already forgotten. But when I picked up the phone and looked at the screen, the name attached to the message made my stomach tighten instantly. It was from my cousin Lily. For a moment, I simply stared at the notification without opening it, feeling that familiar tension spread through my chest again. I had not heard from her in nearly a year. Not since the day she had sat across the table from me in that office with that quiet smirk on her face while I unfolded the envelope. The fact that she was reaching out now felt strange enough on its own, but the timing made it even more unsettling. Almost exactly a year had passed since everything had fallen apart. Eventually, I opened the message. The text itself was short, blunt, and written with the same casual arrogance she had always carried around like it was part of her personality. Are you seriously skipping Grandma's memorial? Everyone else is coming. Stop being selfish. I read the sentence once, then again, letting the words sink in slowly. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the past year, no attempt at understanding why I might not want to see any of them again. The message was written as though the events of the will reading had either never happened or were somehow my fault. The accusation in that last line sat heavily in my chest. Stop being selfish. For several minutes, I sat there holding the phone in my hand, while a mixture of anger and something heavier began pushing its way back into my thoughts. I had spent months trying to bury the memory of that room, the sound of the paper unfolding, the sudden laugh that followed, and the cold silence that filled the space afterward. But that single text message pulled everything back to the surface with a clarity that surprised me. I set the phone down on the table, but the feeling did not fade. Instead, something else began to form in my mind, a thought that had been there quietly for a long time, but that I had never allowed myself to examine too closely. Until that moment, I had been focusing almost entirely on the words themselves, on the cruelty of the message my grandmother had supposedly left behind. I had accepted those two words as a final judgment, painful but definitive, and I had tried to move forward by treating them as something that could not be questioned. But Lily's message reopened the entire memory in a different way. As I replayed the moment in the law office again, something about her expression came back to me with uncomfortable clarity. When I had opened the envelope, when I had pulled out the sheet and read the words written there, Lily had not looked confused or curious or shocked the way someone would normally react to an unexpected moment. She had not leaned forward to see what was written or asked what the message said. She had simply watched me with that small, controlled smirk. She had looked like someone who already knew the outcome. That realization settled into my thoughts slowly at first, but once it appeared, it refused to disappear again. The more I replayed the scene in my head, the more certain I became that her reaction had not been spontaneous. It had been recognition. And if she had recognized what was inside that envelope, it meant she had known about it before I opened it. The idea grew heavier with every minute I sat there thinking about it. I had spent an entire year believing that my grandmother herself had chosen those words deliberately, that she had written them with the intention of excluding me from everything she left behind. But Lily's expression on that day suggested something else entirely, something I had been too stunned and humiliated to consider at the time. If she already knew what was inside that envelope, then someone had told her, or someone had shown her. The thought lingered in my mind until it became impossible to ignore. By the time midnight arrived that evening, I had already pulled my laptop onto the coffee table and begun digging through things I had not looked at in months. At first, I started with the easiest places to search. Old photos stored in my phone, messages I had archived or ignored, social media posts from family members that I had stopped paying attention to after I moved away. I moved backward through time carefully, scrolling through months of pictures and updates that suddenly felt different now that I was looking at them with a new perspective. Most of them were ordinary things: birthday dinners, vacation photos, random snapshots from the lake house that people posted every summer. But I kept going further back, eventually reaching the weeks just before my grandmother's funeral. That was when I found it. The photo had been posted by Lily several weeks before the funeral, back when my grandmother had still been alive, but already too weak to attend most family gatherings. At the time, I probably would have glanced at the picture for a few seconds and moved on without thinking much about it. But now, looking at it again with a different set of memories in my head, the image felt strangely important. The picture showed Lily and Aunt Claire sitting together on the wide porch of the lake house. The background was unmistakable. The same wooden railing, the same view of the water stretching out behind them, the same house that had been the center of our family for decades. Between them sat my grandmother in a large chair, wrapped in a light blanket with a tired but calm expression on her face. At first glance, it looked like a completely ordinary family photo. But when I zoomed in closer, my attention fixed on something resting in my grandmother's lap. It was a thick folder, the kind lawyers often used to carry documents that need to be signed or reviewed. The edges of the papers inside were visible through the opening, and the folder itself looked exactly like the type used for legal paperwork. My grandmother's hands were resting on top of it, while Lily leaned slightly toward her, smiling at the camera. And standing right beside her was Aunt Claire. The three of them were alone at the lake house, and sitting in my grandmother's lap was a folder that looked suspiciously like legal documents. After I saw that photo, something inside me shifted in a way that made it impossible to continue pretending that the past year had simply been a painful misunderstanding I needed to leave behind. The image of my grandmother sitting on that porch with a folder of legal documents resting in her lap stayed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Lily's arm was draped casually along the back of the chair. Claire stood beside them with that same composed posture she always had when she believed she was in control of the situation, and my grandmother looked smaller than I remembered her, wrapped in a blanket with the lake stretching quietly behind her. The longer I stared at that picture, the more it felt like a moment frozen in the middle of something important, something that had happened weeks before the will was ever read in that cramped office. I spent nearly an hour studying the photo, zooming in and out as if the pixels themselves might reveal some hidden detail I had missed before. The folder in her lap looked exactly like the kind lawyers carry when they bring documents for signatures. I had seen enough of those in the office during the will reading to recognize the shape and color. It was not a family photo album or a stack of random papers. It was something official. And Lily had posted that picture publicly without hesitation. That realization made my chest tighten again, because if she had known what those documents were, posting the image almost felt like a quiet victory lap, a moment captured before the consequences unfolded months later in front of the rest of the family. By the time the clock passed midnight, I had already made up my mind. The next morning, I packed a small bag, got into my car, and drove back to my hometown in North Carolina for the first time since the day I left after the will reading. The drive felt longer than I remembered, not because of the distance, but because every mile seemed to pull old memories closer again. Familiar roads appeared one by one, the same exits I used to take when visiting my parents, the same long stretches of highway lined with trees that I had traveled countless times growing up. The entire drive felt like moving backward through time toward a moment I had been avoiding for nearly a year. When I finally pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. The same pale siding, the same small porch with 2 chairs near the front door, the same flower bed my mother insisted on maintaining every spring. Nothing about the place suggested that the last time I had seen my family, everything had fractured in a way that seemed impossible to repair. I stood at the front door for a moment before knocking, feeling a strange mix of anger and hesitation that made my hand pause midair. Eventually, I forced myself to knock anyway. A few seconds later, the door opened. My mother stood there looking slightly older than I remembered, but otherwise completely unchanged. When she saw me, Her expression shifted instantly into something warm and almost relieved, as though I had simply returned from a long trip rather than disappearing from the family for nearly a year. She pulled the door open wider and said my name with the same familiar softness she had always used when greeting me. There was no visible shock, no immediate tension, just a calm welcome that felt strangely disconnected from the weight of the moment. She stepped aside and told me to come in like nothing unusual had happened at all. That normality felt almost surreal. We moved into the living room, and she asked simple questions about how I had been, how the new city was treating me, whether work was going well. Her tone was gentle and cautious, as if she were testing the waters of the conversation. She did not want to push too far too quickly. For several minutes we spoke about ordinary things, but underneath the surface I could feel the real reason I had come there pressing forward. Eventually, I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope, the same envelope the lawyer had handed me nearly a year earlier. The paper was slightly creased now from being carried around and stored away, but my name was still clearly written on the front in my grandmother's familiar cursive. I placed it on the table between us without saying anything. My mother's eyes dropped to it immediately, and that was the moment everything changed. Her reaction was not shock. She did not lean forward in confusion or ask what was the way someone normally would if they had forgotten about it. Instead, her shoulders lowered slightly, and a tired sadness settled across her face in a way that made my chest tighten again. The expression looked less like surprise and more like the quiet resignation of someone who had been hoping this conversation would never happen. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the envelope. Then she looked up at me. There was guilt in her eyes. It was subtle, but impossible to miss once I saw it. The kind of guilt that appears when someone has been carrying knowledge they wish they had handled differently. That was when I understood that she already knew what I had come to ask. The conversation that followed unfolded slowly, with long pauses between sentences, as if each word required careful consideration before it could leave her mouth. At first she tried to explain things gently, circling around the subject instead of confronting it directly. But the more we talked, the clearer it became that there was a story behind those two words that I had never heard before. Eventually, she admitted something that made the entire situation feel even more disturbing than it had on the day of the will reading. According to my grandmother, I had been lying to her. My mother explained that during the final months of my grandmother's life, conversations had started happening behind my back. Claire and Lily had spent more time visiting the lake house while my grandmother's health declined, and during those visits they began telling her things about me that slowly changed the way she saw my behavior. They claimed I only visited when I wanted something from her, that I was manipulating her kindness to secure a place in her will, that every phone call or visit I made was part of some calculated attempt to gain her sympathy and eventually her money. They told her I pretended to care about her health only because I knew she controlled the family's wealth. Hearing those words spoken out loud felt like having something heavy drop into my chest. My mother's voice grew quieter as she continued explaining. She said my grandmother had not believed the accusations immediately. At first she had offended me, reminding them that I had spent years visiting her regularly and writing letters back and forth with her. But Claire and Lily had been persistent. They repeated the same claims again and again, presenting small moments out of context, twisting ordinary interactions into evidence that supported their story. Over time, doubt began to settle into my grandmother's mind. My mother said she could see the change happening slowly during those months. My grandmother would bring up things I had supposedly said or done, asking questions that carried an unfamiliar suspicion beneath them. At first, my mother tried to dismiss those concerns, explaining that the stories were exaggerated or misunderstood. But as the weeks passed, the accusations continued appearing in different forms. Eventually, my grandmother began believing them. When my mother reached that part of the story, her voice faltered slightly. She admitted that she had tried to defend me when the subject came up, reminding my grandmother how often I had visited her and how much time we had spent together over the years. But she also admitted something else, something that carried its own quiet weight. She had believed the conflict would blow over. She thought the tension between the siblings and cousins was just another temporary family disagreement, the kind that had happened countless times before during holidays or gatherings. She assumed that once emotions settled down, my grandmother would realize the accusations did not make sense. Instead, those lies stayed in her mind. They lingered long enough to shape the way she saw me during the final months of her life, and eventually they poisoned the way she chose to say goodbye. After that conversation with my mother, I left the house with a feeling that was heavier than anger but sharper than grief. The story she had told me filled in some of the missing pieces of the past year, but it also created a new problem that sat heavily in my mind the entire drive away from my hometown. Words alone were not enough. Accusations whispered between relatives could easily be denied or reinterpreted, especially by people like Claire and Lily who were skilled at shaping narratives to their advantage. If I was ever going to understand what had truly happened during my grandmother's final months, I needed something more than secondhand explanations. I needed proof. That realization stayed with me for several days until it eventually pushed me into doing something I had not planned when I first returned to town. One night, long after the streets had gone quiet and most of the lights in the neighborhood had turned off, I got back into my car and drove toward the lake house. The road that led there was one I could have followed blindfolded after spending so many summers of my childhood traveling it. The trees along the roadside looked darker and taller at night, their branches forming shadows across the narrow pavement as the headlights cut through the darkness. The entire drive felt strangely familiar and unsettling at the same time, like stepping into a memory that had aged while I was gone. When I finally reached the gravel driveway leading up to the house, the lake beyond it was barely visible in the darkness, a silent stretch of black water reflecting faint pieces of moonlight. The house itself stood exactly as it always had, its large windows dark and still, the wooden porch quiet without the sound of family voices drifting through the evening air. For a moment, I simply sat in the car with the engine off, looking at the place that had once been the center of my family's life. Then I got out and walked toward the front door. I knew exactly where my grandmother had always hidden the spare key. She had shown it to me years earlier during one of my summer visits, explaining that it was important for someone in the family to know how to get inside in case of emergencies. The key was still where she had kept it, tucked carefully behind a loose stone near the side of the porch. When I picked it up, the metal felt cold in my hand. The door unlocked with the same soft click I remember from childhood. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood, old books, and the lingering trace of cleaning products that someone must have used recently. But the deeper feeling of the place was different now. Without my grandmother moving through its rooms, the entire house felt less like a home and more like a preserved memory, almost like a museum dedicated to the life she had built there. The furniture was exactly where it had always been. The same framed photographs still lined the walls. Even the small decorative items on the shelves looked untouched, as though the house had been frozen in time. For a few minutes I stood in the living room, letting the quiet settle around me. My eyes drifted toward the locked chest near the window, the same chest my grandmother had always kept closed when we were children. I remembered wondering what might be inside it when I was younger, imagining it filled with old family treasures or letters from the past. Now that I was standing there as an adult with the entire house empty around me, I knew I could probably break the lock or find a key somewhere if I wanted to. But something told me that was not where I needed to look. My grandmother had always been an organized person, but she had also been careful about where she stored the things that truly mattered. If there were answers hidden anywhere in that house, they would not be placed somewhere obvious enough for everyone in the family to access easily. Instead of touching the chest, I turned toward the hallway that led to the attic stairs. The attic had always been a real storage space, a place filled with boxes that contained decades of accumulated memories. When I was younger, she occasionally let me help her carry things up there or sort through old items during the summer. I remembered rows of labeled boxes, stacks of photo albums, and old furniture pieces she refused to throw away. The wooden steps creaked quietly as I climbed them. The attic was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb that cast long shadows across the wooden floor. Dust floated through the air as I moved between the boxes, each one marked with small handwritten labels that described their contents in simple terms. Old photographs, tax documents, letters, holiday decorations. The space looked exactly the way I remembered it, though the silence made it feel almost sacred. I spent nearly an hour opening boxes and scanning their contents carefully, moving slowly through the rows as if the answers might appear if I was patient enough. Most of what I found were ordinary family items that held sentimental value, but offered no explanation for what had happened during my grandmother's final months. Then I noticed one box sitting slightly apart from the others. The label on it was simple: recordings. I knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside were cassette tapes, dozens of them, each one placed neatly in rows, and every tape had a small handwritten label attached to it. Names and dates covered the plastic surfaces in the same elegant handwriting I recognized from my grandmother's letters. Some labels contained only a name and a year. Others included longer notes written in smaller script. For a moment, I simply stared at them, trying to understand why my grandmother would have recorded conversations with family members. The box looked carefully organized, as though the tapes had been cataloged intentionally rather than stored randomly. I took several of them with me that night, before leaving the house exactly as I had found it, back in my apartment. I had to search for an old cassette player before I could even listen to them. When I finally pressed play on the first tape, the sound that came through the speakers felt strangely intimate. My grandmother's voice filled the room, calm and deliberate, as though she had been speaking to herself while documenting something important. The recordings were not dramatic confrontations or secret arguments the way I had imagined. Instead, they sounded more like personal records. On one tape, she talked about a conversation with my Uncle Robert regarding financial problems he had been trying to hide from the rest of the family. On another, she mentioned Lily's fiancé repeatedly bringing up the subject of financial planning and inheritance in ways that made her uncomfortable. Tape after tape revealed pieces of conversations she had clearly wanted to remember. Then I played the one that changed everything. The recording began quietly with the sound of a chair moving and the faint hum of a ceiling fan somewhere in the background. My grandmother's voice sounded more tired than on the other tapes, as though she had recorded it late in the evening. In that recording, she spoke about a recent visit from Claire and Lily. She described how they had sat with her for hours discussing changes to the will, insisting that certain decisions needed to be made before it was too late. As the recording continued, her tone shifted from calm observation to something closer to uncertainty. She explained that during those conversations they had been telling her troubling things about me, stories about how I had supposedly abandoned her during her illness and only contacted her when I wanted something from her. Hearing my name spoken in that context made my hands tighten around the cassette player, but the most painful moment came near the end of the tape. Her voice grew quieter, almost hesitant, as if she were speaking a thought she was not completely ready to accept. After a long pause, she said something that made the entire room feel suddenly heavier. She whispered that she was beginning to doubt the things she had been told. Then, in a voice that sounded heartbreakingly uncertain, she said the words that changed everything I thought I knew about those two words written in an envelope. She said she thought they may have misled her about Brandon. After listening to that recording for the first time, I sat in silence for a long time with the cassette player still resting on the table in front of me. My grandmother's final words from that tape echoed through my mind in a way that made it impossible to return to the numb acceptance I had lived with for nearly a year. The sentence had been spoken quietly, almost as if she were thinking out loud rather than documenting a conclusion, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. She had begun to question the story she had been told about me. She had started to suspect that the version of events Claire and Lily had fed her might not have been true. The realization changed everything about the way I viewed those two words written inside the envelope. For months I believed they were the final expression of her judgment, the last deliberate message she chose to leave for me. But hearing her voice hesitate on that recording suggested something far more complicated and far more disturbing. If she had started to doubt the accusations near the end of her life, then the will she signed might not have represented what she actually believed anymore. And if Claire and Lily had been pushing her to revise it while filling her head with lies, then what happened in that law office had not simply been a cruel decision. It might have been the result of manipulation. The anger that followed that thought was different from the humiliation I had felt the day I left that office. It was colder, more focused, and far less impulsive. The version of me who walked out of that room a year earlier had been overwhelmed and exposed. The version of me sitting in my apartment now had something far more valuable than emotion. I had evidence, but confronting them immediately would have been a mistake. I knew Claire well enough to understand how quickly she could twist the situation if she had time to react. Lily was the same way in a different form, less polished, but just as willing to reshape the truth to protect herself. If I simply showed up with a cassette tape and accusations, they would deny everything, dismiss the recordings as misunderstandings, and probably convince the rest of the family that I was desperately trying to steal back an inheritance I never deserved. So instead of reacting quickly, I started planning carefully. The first thing I did was digitize every recording from a box. It took hours of transferring audio from the old cassette player into my computer, listening carefully to make sure each file was preserved clearly. Once the recordings were converted, I created multiple copies and stored them in different places. Some stayed on my computer, others went onto external drives, and several were uploaded to cloud storage accounts, so they could never be erased or lost if something happened to the originals. By the time I finished, there were copies of those recordings spread across more locations than anyone in my family would ever know about. The next step was making sure the evidence actually meant something legally. I scheduled a consultation with an estate lawyer in Tennessee and brought the recordings with me. I did not start by accusing anyone directly. Instead, I explained the situation carefully and let him listen to several of the tapes that mentioned Claire and Lily's conversations with my grandmother. He listened quietly with his hands folded on the desk. occasionally taking notes while my grandmother's voice played through the speakers. When the recordings ended, he leaned back slightly in his chair and explained that cases involving manipulation during the creation of a will were not uncommon, especially when elderly relatives were involved. What mattered most in those cases was evidence showing that someone had influenced the person writing the will by feeding them false information or applying pressure. The recordings, he said, could potentially demonstrate exactly that. They showed my grandmother describing conversations in which she was being encouraged to change her will, while also being told damaging lies about me. The fact that she later expressed doubt about those claims could strengthen the argument that her decisions had been influenced by misinformation. The lawyer did not promise a guaranteed outcome, but he confirmed something important. Those tapes mattered. Once I left his office, the plan in my mind became much clearer. I still did not want to confront Claire directly because she was too careful and too experienced at controlling conversations. Lily, on the other hand, had always been more impulsive. Her confidence often made her careless. So I decided to start with her. I sent her a message a few days later suggesting we meet for coffee the next time she was in town. I wrote the message in a calm, almost apologetic tone, explaining that the past year had given me time to think and that I wanted to talk about what happened during the will reading. The message was carefully worded to sound like someone looking for closure rather than someone preparing to dismantle a lie. She responded surprisingly quickly. When we met at a small coffee shop near the center of town, Lily arrived looking exactly the same as she had the last time I saw her. Confident, relaxed, and completely certain she understood the situation better than I did. She sat down across from me with a polite smile that felt almost rehearsed. What she did not know was that my phone was recording the entire conversation. At first, we talked about neutral things, small updates about our lives during the past year. Eventually, the conversation turned toward the subject I had come there to discuss. I asked her calmly why she believed my grandmother had left me that message instead of an inheritance. Her answer came quickly and without hesitation. She repeated the same story my mother had described earlier. She said my grandmother had realized I was not truly family-oriented, that I only visited when it suited me, that I had slowly drifted away from the family while pretending to maintain a relationship with her. According to Lily, my grandmother had finally recognized that I did not deserve to be part of the will. She spoke with such certainty that it was obvious she had told this version of the story many times before. I let her continue talking, occasionally asking small questions that encouraged her to explain further. Each answer she gave only reinforced the same narrative, the same accusations Claire and Lily had apparently planted in my grandmother's mind during her final months. By the time we finished our coffee, I had exactly what I needed. After that meeting, I spent several days organizing everything I had gathered. The recordings from the attic were sorted chronologically. I created written transcripts of the most important conversations, so anyone reading them could easily follow what my grandmother had described. I added the recording from the coffee shop, where Lily confidently repeated the lies she believed were still safe. Then I built something simple but effective, a private website. The site contained the audio recordings, the transcripts, and a detailed timeline explaining how the events had unfolded during the final months of my grandmother's life. It showed when Claire and Lily began visiting her more frequently, when the will was revised, and when my grandmother recorded her doubts about the information she'd been given. Everything was presented calmly and clearly, without emotional commentary, just evidence. When the site was finished, I sent the link anonymously. The first message went to the law firm that had handled the will. The second message went to every extended relative in the family, whose email address I could find. Once the website was sent out, everything that had been buried for nearly a year began unraveling faster than I expected. For months I had lived with the assumption that the story my family believed about me was permanent, that the version of events created by Claire and Lily had already settled into everyone's minds as the official truth. But the moment people started hearing my grandmother's own voice describing those conversations, the narrative began to collapse almost immediately. Within 2 days, the entire family knew. The first reaction came in the form of phone calls. At first, the calls were hesitant, as if the people dialing my number were not completely sure what they were about to say. The first one came from an uncle I had barely spoken to in years, and his voice sounded uncomfortable in a way I had never heard from him before. He told me he had listened to the recordings late the night before, and that hearing my grandmother calmly describing those conversations had made him realize how much had been hidden from the rest of the family. He did not try to defend Claire or Lily. Instead, he apologized quietly for believing the story that had circulated after the will reading. That call was followed by another and then another. Cousins I had not heard from in months reached out, some of them sounding genuinely shaken after listening to tapes. A few of them told me that hearing my grandmother's voice made everything feel real in a way written explanations never could have. She was not accusing anyone directly, but the way she described those conversations made it painfully obvious that she had been pressured and misled during a time when her health was already failing. Several relatives admitted that they had assumed I stopped speaking to the family out of anger over the inheritance. But after hearing the recordings, they realized the situation had been far more complicated than anyone had understood at the time. While the calls kept coming, the reaction from the people who had the most to lose was immediate and telling. Lily's social media accounts disappeared almost overnight. The same profile she had used for years to post carefully curated images of her life vanished within a single day. When relatives tried contacting her, many of them received no response at all. It was as though she had decided that silence was the safest option once the recordings began spreading through the family. Claire reacted differently. Unlike Lily, she did not disappear immediately. Instead, she tried to confront the situation head-on by claiming the recordings were fake. Through a series of tense phone calls and messages sent to relatives, she insisted that the tapes had been manipulated or edited to create a false impression of what my grandmother actually meant. She argued that anyone with basic audio software could alter recordings and that the entire website had probably been created to embarrass her and Lily. But the problem with that argument was simple. Too many people recognized my grandmother's voice. The recordings were not short clips taken out of context. They were long conversations where she spoke naturally about multiple topics, moving from one family member to another while documenting events in a calm, reflective tone. Anyone who had spent time with her could hear the authenticity in the way she spoke. The pauses, the phrasing, the slight tremor in her voice near the end of certain sentences were all unmistakably hers. The more Claire tried to deny it, the less believable her explanations sounded. Then something else happened that shifted the situation even further. The law firm that had handled the will contacted several members of the family to confirm they had received the anonymous link. According to one relative who spoke with them, the lawyers had begun reviewing the final amendment made to the will during the months before my grandmother passed away. They wanted to determine whether the changes had been made under circumstances that might require further examination. I did not receive direct updates from them, but word spread quickly through the family that the situation was no longer just an internal dispute between relatives. Professionals were now looking at the timeline of events that had led to the final version of the will. By the time the one-year memorial service arrived, nearly everyone in the extended family had listened to at least some of the recordings. The service took place at the same church my grandmother had attended for decades, a modest building with tall windows that let in soft morning light, and wooden pews that creaked quietly whenever someone shifted their weight. I had not planned on attending at first, but once the truth began circulating through the family, several relatives encouraged me to come. They told me people wanted to see me there, that the atmosphere around the memorial would be very different from what it might have been a few weeks earlier. When I walked into the church that morning, the room fell into a quiet stillness that felt heavier than any conversation. Dozens of faces turned toward me as I entered, many of them wearing expressions that looked far more complicated than the polite sympathy people usually show at memorial services. Some relatives nodded gently when they saw me. Others offered quiet smiles that carried an unspoken apology. I noticed Claire sitting near the front of the church with a posture that looked rigid and controlled, the same posture she had maintained during the will reading nearly a year earlier. Lily was not there. The service itself began in a calm and respectful way, with hymns and short reflections about my grandmother's life. The pastor spoke about her generosity, her role in bringing the family together over the years, and the way she had opened her home to so many gatherings by the lake. Then, near the end of the service, he paused and explained that a piece of my grandmother's own recorded words had recently come to light. The room grew even quieter as he unfolded a printed sheet of paper. What he read next was not dramatic or accusatory. It was a transcript taken directly from one of the recordings I had found in the attic. In the recording, my grandmother was speaking calmly about visits she had received from family members during the previous year. When the pastor reached the section about me, his voice slowed slightly as he read her words aloud to the entire room. She described how often I had come to see her during the summers, and how I had helped her with small tasks around the house when her health started declining. She spoke about conversations we had shared on the porch in the early mornings, and about the letters we exchanged every year on my birthday. In the recording, she said she was proud of the man I had become and grateful that I had always treated her with patience and kindness. There were no accusations in those words, no bitterness, just the voice of a grandmother describing the grandson she believed she knew. When the pastor finished reading the transcript, the church remained silent for several long seconds. No one moved. The weight of those words seemed to settle across the room as people processed what they had just heard. Then I noticed movement near the front pew. Claire slowly stood up. Her face looked pale and tense in a way that stripped away the composure she had always relied on to control a room. She did not look toward me or toward anyone else as she stepped into the aisle. Without saying a single word, she walked toward the exit at the back of the church. Every person in the room watched her leave. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed softly through the building. And in that quiet moment, for the first time since the envelope had been opened in that cramped law office nearly a year earlier, everyone in the room finally understood the truth.